nursed him and who taught him some things about being a cat, and then they probably never met again. Whereas in humans, the relationship with both parents is critical for most to emerge into adulthood as, as able humans, regardless of what sex we are. So, was it the loss of fathers in the family, the breakdown of the nuclear family that contributed to identity politics? That's not one of the things that I tend to point to, but I think it certainly contributed. I often go a little bit more recently. I say, 30 years ago ish, we start to have this perfect storm um, of postmodernism in academia gaining ground, of legal drugs being shoved at children, and it's different ones for girls and boys because we see different so-called failings in boys and girls. It's the screens, it's the helicopter parenting. But add into that mix having only one parent in a household, so that you don't have the tension, the back and forth, the ability for two parents to actually both have their eyes on a problem, be it a behavior that a child's engaging in, or whatever else, and discuss it. That's going to make things much harder for children growing up. I'm curious.
Jordan.
Yeah.
Sorry, Heather. Jordan, what about you? You've talked about the sexual revolution and its impact in the past. What do you make of all of this?
Well, I think there are two questions that are sort of importantly nested in your question. And one is the issue of identity per se, and why that's become a question. And then the second question is, why has identity politics arisen as an answer to that question? I would say the first issue has arisen because of technological transformation in large part. And you could say that reproductive technology and its consequent effects on the family would be one branch of that. But look, if you look at more traditional societies, and so let's say those are societies that aren't transforming technologically at the same rate that the world is transforming now, the issue of identity doesn't come up that much because there isn't much choice. You do what your parents did. If you're a man, you do what your father did. If you're a woman, you do what your mother did. And the question doesn't arise because the options aren't there. Well, now we have options. And we don't know how many there are, what the limits are, and we don't even know what the options are to some degree, because things change so quick, we can't even keep up with them. I can't keep up with my computer, let alone the world. I mean, it's so interesting, well, and distressing in some sense, and this is partly a function of age. I'm surrounded by gadgets I don't understand, that are changing faster than I can adapt to, that are smarter than me. And that's just one. And I'm actually fairly technologically astute, like I mastered computers, well, to some degree, at least I could use them when I was in my 30s. And, I was sort of on the edge of, I would say, the generation that managed that, at least to some degree. But the issue of identity comes up when the pathway isn't fixed. Well, it's not fixed. Okay, so then see, Nietzsche said at one point that the issue of morality per se, the question of what is moral, doesn't emerge until you compare many moralities. It doesn't emerge as a question. The question before that is what's right and wrong within a given moral system, not is there morality as such. That only comes up when the idea becomes questionable. Well, now we have this problem. What is identity? Well, and then because no one knows the answer to that off the top of their heads and has never generated an articulated and lengthy thought through response to that, someone can say, well, it's your felt sense of gender. It's like, well, maybe. No, actually, that's a very small subset of what it is. That's a very sparse theory. But, your theory of a helicopter is sparse. And so, you know what I mean? If I asked you to draw a helicopter, you'd draw something like a 4-year-old would produce, because what the hell do you know about helicopters? And if you think identity is less complex than a helicopter, well, you're wrong. And so, the issue comes up because we have so many paths to choose from, and then these political answers come up and no one knows what to do with them exactly, because no one can articulate the rationale for the traditional modes of being. That's not easy, like that's hard. Is the family a patriarchal structure? Well, I don't know, maybe. Well, no, upon consideration over many years, here's a counter argument, but it's not like you can just generate that on the fly. And so, we fall prey to these casual critiques in some sense, but they're less casual than our ability to articulate our, implicit beliefs. And so we get caught out all the time. Technological transformation makes us uncertain of who we are, and partly by providing us with more freedom. And then answers arise to the questions that are driven by that, and we have a hard time making philosophical sense of them or defending ourselves against them. I've been trying to think through this idea that human social institutions are fundamentally predicated on the arbitrary expression of power. It's like, well, yeah, sort of, but wait, no, fundamentally that's wrong. But it's not like it's simple to think through, and we can return to that later. So
Heather, before Francis moves on to the next little bit, I was going to ask you: is the family a patriarchal structure?
I don't see it that way, and there are compelling arguments in evolutionary biology space as to how it is that males wield power in the outside world more often in a nuclear family situation than females do. But there's a question then of what your definition of power is. And this will seem like we quickly fall into a semantic trap, but it's, if you're going to argue, patriarchy is about power. That is what, patriarchal refers to. So you have to define power. And if women tend to have power within the family, within social systems, women tend to engage in hierarchies in which the competition is more covert. Men tend to engage in competition and hierarchies that's more overt. And so, that is the power that is more overt. More overt, of course it is, ipso facto, right? You can point to it and say, well, that's where the power is. But the power that women tend to yield, being more cryptic, being more covert, and that's partially because we are sexually dimorphic. We do have some history of some history of polygamy in our past, such that men are on average bigger and stronger and all of this. And so in engagement between the sexes, women aren't going to use aren't going to use physical power. That wouldn't make any sense. That would be a losing move. And so once you start down that road, where women are going to be more likely to be able to compete on something like an even playing field if they're going to be using psychological or social tools as opposed to physical tools when engaging with men, then also you expect, and we see there's plenty of evidence in the psychological literature as to the kinds of competition that women engage in being more covert. So all of that is sort of a background answer to, is the system we live in patriarchal? Only if the only kind of power you're interested in is the overt expressions of power, especially raw physical power.
Well, it's also whether or not you think that the fundamental principle that structures social organizations is in fact the expression of power. And it's not. That's just wrong, I believe. I think it's antithetical to the truth.
What do you think it is?
Well, if you look even at primates like chimps, and chimps are a lot more violent. The males are a lot more violent than human males, at least reactively. And their structure and their social structures are more vicious and violent than human social structures. The alpha male, so to speak, the top chimp, is constantly engaged in grooming and reconciliation, and in stable chimp societies attends to the needs of the females and the infants to a large degree. And so what de Waal has demonstrated quite nicely is that even among chimpanzees, social structures predicated on the arbitrary expression of power, which we could define as the use of force to compel others to act against their wishes, let's say, or against their intrinsic desires, produces very unstable social hierarchies that are ripe for revolution. And the chimps that rule for a long time are markedly cooperative. Now, they're still capable of exerting force, but force isn't the animating principle of the society, which is the claim that, that social relations among humans are predicated on power. That's the claim. Unless we weasel out of the definition of power,
No,
Power is when I get you to do something you don't want to do or else. And that's not the basis for human social institutions. It's an aberration. And people who use power to obtain and maintain their positions are by and large incompetent.
I
not
agree. Yep. I think that's exactly right. And just exactly as you say, alpha males are not brutes in non-human primates, and in human primates where the systems are functional. There may be other males who are brutes, but it's not the alpha. Alphas use affiliative behaviors and conciliatory behaviors and cooperation to accrue loyalty, which then is a way of maintaining power. And that's only sort of in male hierarchy space. And of course, what I think one of the modern problems that we are experiencing is male hierarchies and female hierarchies both exist. They follow different rules. There are different rules of engagement. It's a very rare species that actually has both, because typically in other species, one or the other sex disperses, and you also don't have multiple males and multiple females in a group together. Baboons being an interesting exception to that. But for us, we've combined. We now live in this attempting to be egalitarian world where we've got this, call it 6 million years since we split with the ancestors of bonobos and chimps. 6 million years of evolution within our particular lineage, in which we've got female hierarchical relationships and male hierarchical relationships. And now, I don't know, post-industrial, something since at least agriculture. So at a maximum 10,000 years old, we're combining these two hierarchies, and we're pretending it's just going to be easy and fine. And we have to figure it out. Like, we have to figure out how to work together. But imagining that we're just going to default into male style of hierarchy and it's going to be cool with all the women, or that we're going to just default into female style of hierarchy and it's going to be cool with all the men, is an amazing error. And in fact, what I feel like we see is this like pendulum swing from, well, we were just doing it the male way because women came into sort of the external realizations of power later. And that wasn't really working for everyone. And at the moment, we're seeing this pendulum swing over into really female styles of dominance relationship. And it's equally dysfunctional. It's just something we don't have as much history with recognizing, but that doesn't make it any better. This idea that the future is female. No, the future is all of us.
That's a very controversial thing to say, especially nowadays, Heather.
Right.
But don't you think part of this problem, and I'll direct this question first at Jordan, is that we now think that we are above animals. We think that we are evolved, that we are higher, superior, more intelligent. But isn't that one of our main failings, not acknowledging the fact that we are part of the animal world?
Well, I think it's very useful to inform your ideas about what constitutes human beings by looking at carefully controlled experiments on animals and observations of animals. Because, well, if you look at our morphology, our physiology, I mean, we share organs pretty much all the way down the vertebrate chain. There's a lot about us that's like other creatures. Now, there's important differences too. So you look across species and you try to make comparisons where that seems useful. And sometimes that can clue you into how things originated. So Dewall, for example, who primarily studied chimpanzees, has looked at the emotional basis of morality as it emerged in chimpanzees. And before that, people like Jaak Panksepp, who's a brilliant animal rat psychologist, essentially, rat researcher of rats, showed that even rats engage in fair play when you put them together in repeated play bouts. So if a big rat can dominate a little rat by the expression of power, which he can do if he's about 10% bigger, he will do that if you put them together and they play once. But if they play repeatedly, if the big rat doesn't let the little rat win 30% of the time, at least, the little rat will stop playing. And the proclivity for reciprocity has been well documented in many mammalian species. And so we can see that our behavioral patterns have roots that are very deep, and that's useful. It helps clarify the philosophical discussion. It helps us understand ourselves better. It helps us understand that moral behavior, for example, isn't merely a consequence of rational decision making or a rational inference, let's say. It's much more deeply rooted in us than that. And so now, having said that, I would also say there are many important differences between human beings and other animals, not least our linguistic capacity and our incredible capacity for complex mimicry, which is unparalleled, I would say, and our visual ability. There's lots of things about us that are quite unique, but you try to derive your wisdom where you can, and you're a fool if you ignore biology. And it's a lot easier to ignore it because it's actually difficult to study, and you have to work at it, and so it's easier, especially if you're driven by utopian social theory that implies that human beings are infinitely malleable, and you want to make them malleable in your mold of what constitutes the ideal. Well, then you can ignore biology and call people biological essentialists and other such idiocy, and we see a fair bit of that.
And Heather, what do you think? Do you think by turning our back on the animal world, thinking that that blank slateism, etc., what we've actually done is create a whole raft of problems for ourselves that didn't exist before?
We're absolutely creating a whole raft of problems for ourselves. I would add to what Jordan said another way in to point out how similar we are to many other species out there. That what Jordan's pointing out is our shared history, our shared phylogenetic history, evolutionary history, such that we can look at non-human primates and see in chimps and bonobos, who are our two closest extant relatives, many similarities, ability to, and yet chimps and bonobos are so different socially. One of them, bonobos, tend very much towards explicit affiliation and peacemaking, and one of them, chimps, not as much, with the big caveat, as Jordan indicated before, that the alpha is actually a conciliatory figure. And you go farther back, you go into other mammals, and yes, because we all share this sort of founding thing that for which we are named, mammary glands, that obligates us to maternal care, and that obligates us to sociality and relationship, and it brings in love, and therefore we get this sort of cascading series of events wherein we have closer relationships than we're at least obligated by anatomy and physiology before the evolution of milk and lactation. But I would say that that's actually not even the most interesting thing, that we can also look to birds. And our most recent common ancestor with birds was some, reptile-y thing that bears no resemblance to any extant reptile now, many hundreds of millions of years ago. So birds and mammals are not all that closely related, but in some species of birds, in crows, in parrots, in a variety of lineages of birds, we also find what looks like love and long-term relationships and fair play and exchanging of ideas. So what is common? How is it that we have converged between crows and parrots and dolphins and elephants and wolves and chimps and humans? And I'm leaving some things off that list, but that list is social, but there's a lot more things than that are social, long-lived, generational overlap, so you can have exchange of ideas and learning between generations, and long childhoods, so that these organisms are born or hatched, depending on if they're mammals or birds, without yet fully being what they're going to be. Compare that to, any mammal, is somewhat what we call altricial, which is to say born, not fully able yet to do everything it's going to do because it's going to need milk from its mother. But a horse, within a half an hour of being born, is able to run around and keep up with the herd-ish, because if not, it's going to get eaten. Whereas the more altricial you're born, the more helpless you're born, the more software you are. So no, we're not blank slates. And this is something that that Brett and I talk about a lot, and we've actually written into the book that we have coming out in the chapters on childhood and on parenthood and relationship. We're not blank slates, but we argue, the blankest slates of any species on the planet. When we are born with whatever genetics we have on board, we have the most potential of any species on the planet to become anything else. Our fate as individuals is less guaranteed at birth than even for a dolphin or an elephant or a parrot, and certainly than for a squid or a cedar or a mouse. So yeah, we aren't blank slates, but we have tremendous potential to become almost anything. And that's not at odds with the pushback that you guys, all of you and I as well are giving to identity politics, because that, that I think identity politics is a failure of an understanding of emergence, that the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. It is a reductionist approach, that the identity politics says, I am white and female and middle-aged and American and, overeducated. And okay, all of those things are true, but they don't even begin to encompass a description of me. And I could do the same thing for any of you or any other human being. And that is a reductionist, sort of metric-laden approach to an understanding of what humans are.
It's an insistence.
It's an insistence,
Yeah,
and
and
it's
whereas,
it's an enumeracy too. Like, if you can count it, then it's real. And no, sometimes the most important things aren't countable, and sometimes the things that you can count don't matter. So let's be our whole best selves, as opposed to reducing us to the things that you can label.
I wanted to weave a couple of the themes that we've talked about together there, particularly technology and the sexual dimorphism that is inherent in us. Do you think there will come a point where technologically we're capable of eradicating that, should we choose to? There seems to be a lot of people who'd like to do that.
Sexual dimorphism?
Yeah. Or to compensate for it somehow in a way that it doesn't manifest itself in the way that it currently does, where one sex is stronger and therefore quote unquote more oppressive, and the other one is, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, no, of course. I mean, I think this is just, can I swear here?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
This is just batshit crazy, right? Like, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, and all options were on the table for me. And granted, I grew up on, the West Coast of America with parents who, looked at me and said, okay, we weren't expecting that in a girl, but cool. You want to be mathy, you want to be sportsy, like, go for it, do those things. And it was because the world seemed to be willing to abandon those regressive gender roles that weren't necessary anymore, without ever pretending that me being good at math meant I wasn't a girl. Right? Like, that's the thing that we are emerging into now. It's this regressive backward slide into stereotypes that I thought we were free of. Like, actually, no, men can't gestate or lactate or give birth or any of that. And if you are a particularly caregiving man who wants to be the primary parent for your child, that's awesome, but you still don't get to breastfeed, because that's not what men do. Right? So, like, we can get rid of a lot of the layer on top that we weren't able to before. And, there's a tension, as you, Jordan, have pointed out, like, we've got all this freedom, and you push it too far and you get people really, really confused and unable to make choices among all of the things that are downstream of the freedom. But if we can just hold on to the, the reality at base, and then say, okay, now, if you're a scientist, that doesn't make you male-ish. And if you're an artist, that doesn't make you female-ish. And we should be able to live in that world. I feel like that is the world that we were creating until, frankly, until sort of the 90s, when this grip on academia that looked postmodern and post-structuralist was happening. And then it bled out into the schools of ed and the media and Hollywood and big tech and every place else.
And Jordan, do you think the problem comes from the fact that we don't believe in religion anymore? And if you don't believe in religion, I don't know who said this, then you don't believe. People need to believe in something. And as a result, what we've taken is identity politics as a way to belong to a group. Or do you think it's far more complex than that?
Well, there's a New Testament doctrine that you render unto Caesar what is Caesar, and unto God what is God's. And I actually think that's a very astute psychological statement. And now it depends on whether or not you believe that human beings have a religious instinct. And I think broadly that the answer to that is that they do, for a variety of reasons. First of all, religious experience is elicitable by biochemical means. So that's pretty powerful evidence right there. But there are all sorts of religious-like experiences that we all pursue. So we feel awe to beauty. We feel awe to the ideal. We participate in like mass worship of sports prowess. We like to see people hit the target, which is the opposite of sin, which means to miss the target. We get enraptured by a gospel-oriented rock performance in a stadium, and we do that with other people, and it fills us with enthusiasm, which is to be filled with God, because that's what enthusiasm means. We feel awe towards certain actions that people undertake, particularly if they're radically altruistic or radically truthful. We're possessed by the desire to mimic people that we see act out an ideal that we don't understand, et cetera, et cetera. And like I've made a list of about 50 of these things that I'm not going to go through all of them, but so you imagine there's an instinct that orients us towards the ideal, and that would be part of the consequence of us having to emerge from this insufficient biological substructure that Heather was talking about and move towards whatever we could be. We need a vision of what that is. And I believe that vision is deeply influenced by biological factors, reciprocity, for example, which would emerge again from the phenomena that our social nature, our protracted childhood dependence, etc. It's emergent property of that. All of that is reflective of religious instinct. So now then you might posit societies have to organize themselves so that that religious instinct is fulfilled without it disrupting other functions, or without other functions being disrupted by it. So the religious system collapses. The need for it doesn't disappear. And so then what happens, as far as I can tell, is it just plummets down the value hierarchy until it hits a point where it can find some satisfaction. So politics becomes religion. And then look out. Because see, maybe we have some sense of an absolute ideal. We have the need for an absolute ideal. And maybe you make that abstract and you view that as God, and God is distant and ineffable and undefinable and abstract and eternal. He's not local to your country and your place, like a figure like Stalin or Mao. And maybe if you don't have something to project that ideal onto, something abstracted, let's say, and perhaps even something communal, then it starts to contaminate other functions. And I think this is where the new atheists went so wrong. They assumed that if we just dispensed with all that idiotic superstition, we'd all become, avatars of Richard Dawkins style logic, assuming we had the capability, which we generally don't. And I just don't see that that's true. I don't see any evidence that that's the case. I think what happens is we dispense with the catastrophic superstition of Catholicism and end up swallowing something much more ungainly and horrible.
Jordan, I want to latch on to that, because we've been talking about religion and how we've turned our back on religion. Don't you think a lot of these crises come from the fact that we don't yet know in the West how to address the issue of death? And you can see the way we dealt with COVID. To me, it seemed like a moral crisis. It seemed like a general panic. We don't know how to address the fact that we're mortal. And as a result of that, we just seem to be scrabbling around for anything, don't we? Including identity politics.
Well, I think there's some truth in that. I mean, one of the existential facts that compels us to ask religious questions is the fact of death. And that's why I also think you can't eradicate religion, for that matter, because what are you going to do? You're going to eradicate people's concern with death? I don't think so. And I've been at funerals and people stand around and they don't know what to say to each other. Not really. Maybe they can give each other a hug. That's something, isn't it? But they don't know what to say. And that's because we're all speechless in the face of mortality. But that doesn't erase the question. And the question begs an answer. What's it all for? Well, we're trying to figure that out in our collective religious ideation, let's say. So, for example, when I look at Christianity, I think, well, at minimum, speaking as a psychologist, the figure of Christ is the consequence of a centuries-long, a millennial-long discussion of what constitutes the ideal human being. Now, you might ask, is it any more than that? That would be a metaphysical question, but it's certainly at least that. And as that ideal, well, have you got a better solution to that problem? You know, you think about how it's expressed. That ideal is expressed in music, it's expressed in art, it's expressed in literature, it's expressed in architecture, it's expressed in dogma and spiritual belief and experience and commitment and faith, all of that. It's a very multi-dimensional conception. And you know, you can dispense with it rationally, but well, then what? You got something better? Well, no, you don't. You have something that looks like a set of arbitrary axiomatic assumptions that are enforced by fiat. And that's not a, like, part of Christianity, let's say, was an exploration of what the ideal was. There was at least that exploratory element. I mean, I know things degenerate into insistence, but it wasn't. You really think all of that was insistence by force? I don't think that's a plausible explanation in the least. I mean, Christ isn't the sort of character that a power-hungry maniac would dream up to exercise arbitrary control over a docile population. That just doesn't make sense. I'm going to give our ancestors and us more credit than that. You know, we were at least trying to figure out how to be ideally in the face of our catastrophic morality. And that question, that's not going away.
Heather, I can't see your facial expressions at the moment, which is deeply frustrating to me, because I suspect I can't tell whether there's a lot of agreement or disagreement with you on this. Tell me, from an evolutionary biologist perspective, what is the function of religion? Do we need it to thrive as a species?
Well, I'm gonna punt the first part of that a bit, because it warrants its own dedicated conversation. But I agree. I agree very much with what Jordan was saying, and I think it actually indicates the problems with modernity, in part, are about a decohering. So I also agree with the problems with the new atheists. Atheist is a term that I have used to describe myself, but never new atheist, and that comes with the full understanding that religion has adaptive value, that if it did not, we wouldn't find every single culture in the history of humanity having had some form of religion. And what does it mean for us to be abandoning religion so quickly? Well, we can see part of it. You know, add this to the perfect storm of why it is that people are grasping for meaning. Because sure, any system that becomes orthodox, that becomes the representation of the sacred, will begin to become corrupt. Like this is the nature of systems, and they will need to be renewed, and there needs to be tension. Again, you know, again, one of the concepts that Brett and I explore in our forthcoming book, there needs to be tension between orthodoxy and heterodoxy, between the sacred and the shamanistic. And without this system that people are raised into, and they can say, I see that, I see the sacred there, I see the holy, and maybe I want to go to it, and maybe I want to turn away, people are just unable to even know where to find meaning. And so, you know, mind, body, and soul. I don't know, I don't have a brilliant grasp of what all is meant by soul, although much of it is in what Jordan is talking about, in the ineffable, in awe, in glory, what we feel when we experience a piece of music that just moves us viscerally. But even that, you know, that word that I just used at the end, that is a recognition that they all tie together. Visceral, it's body, right? And so much of what we're experiencing now, the decohering of not just society, but I think of individuals, is people thinking, well, I don't need any of the stuff of the past. I don't even need to be tied to my own body. I can pretend that the thing that I am from the very beginning is simply a social assignment. No, like all of this is who we are. Everything about our mind and our soul is embodied as well. And imagining otherwise is wrong. So, you know, I admitted that I was going to punt the question of exactly what religion is for evolutionarily up front, and I did. But what I did say clearly was, given that every culture ever known has had some form of religion, we know there is adaptive value in it, and there is yet to be a culture that is completely without religion that is succeeding widely. And, there will be those, and Jordan is much better positioned to speak to this than I am, who knows more history than I am. There will be those who will argue perhaps, that China is an exception, but I think that some of what is passing for ideology, for instance, there is unto a new religion. Something will fill the vacuum. When
No, and
And you say
Christianity is growing faster in China than it did in Rome when it first emerged. So,
there it is. Yeah.
that's an interest, and the suppression is probably helping it.
No doubt.
It seems that there's an emergent issue. Heather, maybe you can tell me what you think about this if you don't mind. So, we have to organize ourselves in relationship to values, because we can't figure out what to pursue unless we rank order things, because we can't pursue everything at once. And so we have to rank order things in terms of their value and their approachability. So then imagine that, well, out of that, we can abstract something like value as such, right?
Mhm.
And then you might say, well, there's an implicit understanding there that there are higher and lower values. And the whole value hierarchy is oriented around whatever value is. And you could say that the drive to God is the drive to understand the central factor that organizes all value. Or you could say it's representative of the thing that's at the top of a properly structured value hierarchy. And we all kind of have an intimation of that. I mean, everyone I ever met upbraids themselves for not being all they could be. Well, compared to what exactly? Well, something,
Compared to the
right?
ideal that we hold.
What's that?
Compared to the ideal that we hold in our heads. right?
Yes, it's an odd ideal, because what it does is whack you when you've deviated from it, and then your conscience tortures you. Now, conscience can go astray. It can be too severe, and it can bring you down. So it's not an unerring guide, but it's an interesting phenomenon, because it sort of operates independently, and it's not subject to your will exactly. Because wouldn't we all be able to just dispense with the dictates of conscience? No, you compare yourself to an implicit ideal, and you torture yourself to the degree that you deviate. And you might rationalize and lie and deceive and try to ignore it and all of those things, but I've never seen that work. And so
Yeah.
that's another example, I think, of something that's akin to, well, that's partly the function of religion from a social and biological perspective. It's like it orients you towards a collective ideal.
I think that's actually absolutely right. If I may tell an anecdote from my deep history, maybe the first time that I was in Madagascar, Brett and I were in Madagascar before I was doing my research there, and we'd been on I don't remember the numbers, but it was something like a 43-hour bus ride that took us only 430 kilometers across the southern half of Madagascar. It was excruciating in every regard. But we met a young man who was on the bus with us, who invited us at our end point to have dinner with his family, and it was at the home of a female judge. This was the early 90s. Female judge and her husband, whose line of work I don't remember, and they were solidly middle class Malagasy, which still bears almost no relationship to what middle class looks like in the weird world, in the Western educated, industrialized, rich democratic world. But we were having a very interesting meal, mostly in French. We spoke almost no Malagasy, and they spoke almost no English. Until one of them, it was extended families. There's like 8 or 9 of the Malagasy family, and Brett and me, as young, between college and graduate school at that point, so 22, 23, something. One of them asked us what our religion was, and we said we didn't have any. We didn't say we were atheists, and Brett actually will not use that word about himself. We said we didn't have any, and they recoiled in horror, and they almost kicked us out of the house. And if we hadn't already had an hour and a half with them, establishing rapport and establishing that we were decent human beings, I think they would have. And the conversation that continued forward was them trying to figure out how we could possibly be relied on to be moral if we didn't have religion. And I think having been forced into that conversation by well-meaning Malagasy people in my early 20s, really, forced into full consciousness, how is it then that if I am not answering to a God, that I am going to be, who do I answer to, right? And is it this sort of invisible pyramid of values? What is it exactly? And it can't be just you. It has to be, in my case, I'm very lucky. And, Brett and I had each other then, and we still do. And so, to have someone else to whom you can always go to and say, tell me if I've done wrong. You tell me if I've done wrong, and you don't hold back. And better if you have a few of those people, because, absent imagining that someone is up there who can see all, you need more than just your own honesty, no matter how honest you are.
Francis, aren't you glad you and I have each other?
No, to put it quite simply. But Jordan, I was gonna ask. So we are currently experiencing a pandemic. Do you think that's going to see a reawakening of religion as we're confronted with our own mortality, as we're reminded that actually we are not these omnipotent beings? We don't have control over Mother Nature. We can't even control something as simple as a virus.
Which religion is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Randy Thornhill, who studied the relationship between infectious disease and political belief, would predict that people will become more conservative as a consequence of this. And so that's one possibility. I think that when you're faced with a challenge, the issue of what constitutes the ideal and what constitutes deviation from that starts to loom large, right? And there's a reason for that, which is when you're subjected to a catastrophe, one of the logical things to do is to figure out where you went wrong so it didn't happen again. And to figure out where you went wrong is to do something like what Heather described doing with Brett, except internally, right? You posit an ideal in your imagination, and you make that into an avatar. That avatar becomes your judge, and you have a conversation with it. Something like that, or maybe that's all played out at the level of emotion, but that's not optimal. You want to be able to articulate it. And then you call yourself on it. You say, well, maybe if I was a better person, this wouldn't happen to me. And sometimes that's not true. Sometimes you just got run over by a bus driven by a maniac, right? It's just you're in the wrong place at the wrong time, and tough luck for you. But by and large, if you take account of those things that you can take account of, the desire to not reproduce past errors that produced a catastrophe is a pretty useful approach. And we abstract these things up to a very, very high level. And that's one of the things that's very peculiar about human beings is, well, another thing that God is the voice of the omniscient collective within. And, you might object, well, that's not God. It's like, well, these things are not as obvious as they look. I mean, the conscience, again, calling to you from within. I mean, here's part of what that is. So imagine that you're subject to social pressure of all sorts, right? And you see that social structure abstracted as well in literature and stories. And so that's like a concentrated social structure. And you're just completely bombarded by that information all the time. And you build an internal representation of the spirit that characterizes, and it's what calls you out on your own misbehavior. But that spirit is something that has aggregated itself over God only knows how long, since the dawn of consciousness itself, a long, long time. And so distinguishing that from something omniscient that's watching you, that's not so easy. And you might say, well, that's still not a metaphysical claim. It's like, fair enough. But when you tangle in the fact that consciousness itself generated that, at least in part, and that you have no idea whatsoever what consciousness is, then you start to skirt the edges of a profound metaphysics of, like, the omniscient observer pretty closely. And those things aren't easily rationalized away, not as far as I can tell. The deeper I've looked into it, the more peculiar and odd it becomes, especially when you start to think about consciousness itself. So,
Heather, I want to give you the last word on this because I want to move on to something a little bit different. So is there anything you'd like to add?
Hours worth, but maybe we move on, because that was a great place to end, I think, on consciousness.
All right. Well, listen, in addition to both of you being experts in your field and really making a significant contribution to the sort of abstract discussion, there's something else that we wanted to talk to you about, which I think is very relevant both of you have made a stand at one point or another for something that you felt was important to make a stand about, whether it was principle, whether it was the line being crossed, whether it was an approach that you just felt was not appropriate. And I think increasingly all of us in our society are confronted with the fact that there are certain things that are being violated on the one hand that we're unwilling to see violated and say nothing. And on the other hand, it's very easy at the same time to descend into the sort of social media driven desire to destroy people with facts and logic, quote unquote, and have these pointless, meaningless, superficial, trivial battles with each other on the time. And I was wondering, as you two people who've managed to be at the very, in the very heart of this argument that is raging in Western society, yet conduct yourself with a lot of dignity. How do we as individuals pick our battles so that we can distinguish between making a stand on something that's really important without finding that Nietzsche quote, the abyss is staring so much back into us that we become the monster that we're fighting?
There's a lot to say. And there's not going to be a one-size-fits-all answer. Definitely pick your battles and don't spend time waiting in mucking about battles that you have decided that you're not going to fight in. It used to be, before social media was so ubiquitous, that authors would say, I only read a couple of reviews, or I don't read reviews at all, because getting that into my head is not helpful for my creative process. And I think there's a lot of truth in that, we need to be able to hear our critics. Certainly as a scientist, being to ideas that challenge what it is that you currently think is true is absolutely paramount, right? So how do you walk that fine line where you can be open enough to hear reasonable challenge from good faith interlocutors and not find yourself just pelted with tomatoes hurled by sometimes real people, but often not even, right? So the fact that much of the chaos online doesn't even seem to be organic, actually for me makes it easier to say, you know what, off, just not doing that, because I'm not turning off people. I'm turning off some combination of people and chaos. And I suspect, actually, Jordan, that you and I and Brett are effective in some ways in this realm for similar reasons. That even though you were a professor also for many, many years, it was, I think, your clinical psychology practice and your relationship with your patients that gave you such a deep sense of the humanity of people. And in Brett's and my case, it was the particular institution we were at and the way that we were able to teach. And so it was our relationship with our students, wherein you see that so many people in their interactions with other human beings actually kind of maybe don't even regard the person on the other side as a full human. And we see the dehumanization certainly in Brexit era and Trump era, and just each side picking a moment, a person aside, and accusing fully half of the population of not quite being real, honestly, deplorable or reprehensible or incompetent or whatever it is. And I think that having been face to face with so many people, patients in your case, Jordan, and students in my case, who I just came to know so well, what I say is that teaching actually made me much less of a misanthrope than I used to be. I used to have almost no hope for humanity. And people who were superficially familiar with what happened at Evergreen would be like, "Are you kidding me? It was those Yahoo students who took Brett out," and were like, "No, actually, the Yahoo students were indoctrinated by Yahoo faculty who were in charge there. That was the indoctrinated faculty and staff who did that,
and the cowardly administrators."
Oh, for sure, the cowardly administrators. Yes. But none of our students behaved that way. Our students were loyal to a person. because we treated them like whole human beings. And what I used to say at Evergreen was, my God, the bar for being an educator at the college level should be, something real, you know how to communicate it, and you fundamentally believe in the humanity of your students. And I'm shocked at how many people fail one or two or all of those. And so I do think that for those of us who do have something real to share, do know how to communicate it, and do fundamentally believe in the humanity of the people on the other side, that comes across. It's clear that we're real and human and actually, fallible, but doing our best. And it probably also makes us more susceptible to garbage arguments from bad faith actors that come our way. And so it may be, for me, I say, you know what, I am willing to just, shut the curtain a lot of the time, because I know that I engage truly and honestly and really with people when I know they're actually people. And I therefore don't have to with a lot of the social media stuff.
And Jordan, how do you manage to keep your head when all around you are losing theirs?
Well, it isn't self-evident that I did. I mean, first of all, battles pick you much as you pick them, maybe more. When I made the first video I was playing around with YouTube. I put my lectures on YouTube. I had a little bit of experience with TV in Ontario, so I was dabbling. And I didn't know what YouTube was. Neither did anybody else. I didn't know it was going to be the world's biggest television network by an order of magnitude. I thought it was a place for cute cat videos.
It still is, to be fair.
Yeah, well, fair enough. Maybe that says something positive about people too. So, but I got swept up, and it's in many ways it's been absolutely devastating. So now I decided a long time ago that I was going to say what I thought, that I was going to try to orient myself. And I think I had experiences that were similar. Heather said something very interesting, that she's much less misanthropic than she might have been had she not been a teacher, a caring teacher. Well, the spirit that animates our social institutions is a lot more in the nature of caring teacher with deviation than it is power-hungry tyrant. I really believe that. I mean, and you have to be extraordinarily cynical not to see at least some of that. And so the people I've known that were competent in their positions in competent institutions were mentors who encouraged. And that's a good relationship to have with people. And it's the opposite of the arbitrary expression of power. And it's something you do, both of you, the mentor and the mentee, let's say the teacher and the student, you do that in the service of a higher ideal. And I've never met anyone that I admired who exploited their students, who considered that a power. I mean, I've met professors who didn't put their graduate students' names on research papers or were stingy about credit, but it's not like they were thriving. It just doesn't work. So, and when do you stay silent? Well, you stay silent until the weight of having to lie is worse than the danger of speaking. And I'm not fond of deceptive silence or outright lies. I in my clinical practice, I never, ever, ever, ever saw anyone get away with anything. And so that was horrible. It's horrible to think that that's true. It's true. You think you got away with it. You just don't know the causal chain that led to your demise. So, that plus my understanding too, that one of the factors that sustained and generated totalitarian atrocity was the willingness of ordinary people to swallow things they knew to not be true. And that was insisted upon by the sophisticated observers of totalitarian states that I found most influential. You swallow enough lies, your state becomes a monster. And so, I've upbraided myself continually for bringing the chaos of the world into my nice, tidy little family. And it's been terrible. But, in my defense, I would say, I'm trying to stave off something worse. And if you think that it can't get worse, that just means you don't know anything. So
Yeah,
You
Jordan,
know,
it's
it's
a
up
good
to
point.
everybody and their conscience, you
Mm.
know. And I think it's a matter of figuring out what to be afraid of. I'm more afraid of silence and lies. I think they're
As am
more
I.
terrifying.
As am I. I mean, you know that I was born in the Soviet Union, and I've seen the process of whereby people are having to make those decisions every day. And actually, that's very much the reason we asked you both this question, because you are both remarkable people in your own right, and you've, as you say, you've suffered terribly, both of you, for what you took a stand on. But also, people would argue you've been rewarded, and I would argue you've had both, right? You've been punished and rewarded at the same time. But there are a lot of people who maybe they're wrong, but they do feel, you know, we get the messages every day. I'm sure you get heaps of messages every day from people saying, look, I hate the fact that my kids are being indoctrinated at school, but I also want to be able to feed them. And if I lose my job speaking out, then okay, great, they're not being indoctrinated anymore. Maybe they still are, but I'm also not able to feed them anymore. How do ordinary people who are not college professors, let's say, who may not become a YouTube host or whatever it is, who maybe don't feel that they want to be a public person as a result of making some kind of stand, how do they square those two conflicting desires, Heather?
I don't
There's
know.
an easy question for you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, we're all
No,
trying to
I mean,
work it out.
you're right. I'm sure that all of our inboxes look similar in this regard, and it's heartbreaking. And I do, when Evergreen was actively blowing up, I was saying, you know, I completely understand why all of the people who are coming to us privately to say, I see what's going on and I support you, but I can't have your back publicly. I felt very generous to them then, and I feel less generous to them now. And I actually I'm a little surprised that that's the direction it's gone. What is clear is if there is a fever pitch, if there is a moment, then you need a critical mass of people to stand up, and you can stop it. I don't know what the equivalent of that is when there's not a precipitating event, right? Because most of social media is just this slow burn, and I don't know what it would mean to stand up en masse there. I don't think there is any virtual equivalent in that slow burn space. But when there is an event and someone is, you know, someone's the witch, when someone's a witch and there are 30% of people in the organization who are privately saying, oh my God, this is really dangerous and bad. And half of them are saying to the would-be witch, I know you're not a witch, but I can't stand up. If that 15%, you know, and I'm making up numbers here, but you know, if some substantial minority of people can actually see what's going on, I think that's actually a conservative estimate. And then even 50% of those people said, this will not stand, not in my name, no, then those events can get turned back. And you know, I don't in the particular case of my story, I don't know that the institution was savable, even if 15% of the faculty and staff had gone public with, you know, and we know that at least that number of people actually saw what was going on and didn't approve. But in some cases, systems aren't that far gone and they would be savable. And it requires courage. And that wasn't easy for me to feel back when we were losing 2 tenured positions and that was all we knew. And it feels easy to, you know, it may feel like it's easy for me to say now with the hindsight of 4 years and, you know, effectively being funded by the crowd. And it's, you know, it's both less security and vastly more security. Most people won't end up in, you know, being able to transition in that way, nor will they want to, exactly as you said, Constantine. So how can you encourage people to stand up in defense of the system that they are in, you know, the functionality of the institution that they're at, such that it can continue on without being captured, without any more witch hunts? You know, that's the piece of it that I don't exactly know.
You know what? It has to be something like don't lie. You know,
Yeah.
like if you're being called upon to lie or to bury your head in the sand,
Yeah.
well, where's that going to end? It's not going to stop. It isn't how it works as far as I can tell. So
Yeah.
it has to be something like that. And I mean, I'm not saying these are easy decisions. I'm certainly not saying that I made the right decision. I hope that they'd have to cart my skeleton out of the University of Toronto. You know, I liked my job a lot. It was just fine. And you know, it's been nothing but chaos and upheaval since then. I mean, I have been rewarded, but
Mm.
I haven't been rewarded with security, something like that. That's not the right word exactly.
Stability, maybe.
Yeah, well, it's
Stability,
high
I was
risk,
gonna
high
say.
reward. Fine.
Right.
But I would have
Yeah.
settled for much less reward and much less risk. So, and I was perfectly happy with that. Now, I'm not ungrateful for what I've accrued in the meantime, but it's not an improvement, that's for sure. And I wouldn't lecture people about, you know, their moral obligation, because you've pointed out the problem. It's the proximal cost and the distal reward, right? You know, you see a system degenerating and you're going to say something, and the cost to you is going to be bloody high, and the impact is going to be perhaps not even measurable.
Mm.
But then you run into the problem that Heather just described, which is, well, if 70% of you don't like what's going on and you don't say anything, then, you know, where is it going to end? And people have to make those moral decisions for themselves. The only thing that I know, perhaps, is that lying doesn't seem like a good idea, and being forced to, particularly, you know, this is where I took my stand. I'm not saying other things that other people want me to say. It's like, up yours. You go and live the consequences of your speech, and I'll live the consequences of mine. And I'm not going to live the consequences of your speech. And that's where my government went too far, as far as I was concerned. It's like, no compelled speech. I don't give a damn what your rationale is. Because why should I trust your rationale when you're transgressing against something so sacred? Why would I possibly trust your rationale? There isn't anything more sacred than the word. I mean, unless you want to just dispense with our accrued morality in its entirety, the one thing we've more or less agreed on in the, you know, relatively Christian West, or perhaps the Judeo-Christian West, is that the word is sacred.
Mm.
Well, if you want to throw that out, be my guest, but you're not getting me to throw that out. So now, whether I'm right about that or not, well, probably, you know, right, Christ, there's lots of ways I'm not right. I can tell you that, but
Jordan,
lying is
sorry,
not
go
a
for
good
it.
idea.
You say that lying is not a good idea. Do we need to redefine the meaning of courage? In particular, when we look at courage, what it used to mean in generations past, going to war. Well, really, you look at a lot of the courageous people now, they tend to be whistleblowers. They tend to be people who stand out from the crowd and say that they don't agree. Do we need to redefine what it means to be courageous?
I think that's always been the case. I mean, if you look at the prophetic tradition in the Old Testament, that's just one story after another of society degenerating towards a tyrannical state and a prophetic voice emerging,
Mm.
you know, representative of God in some abstract sense, saying, be careful, you're deviating from the proper path. And if you don't think there are going to be consequences, you're just not paying enough attention. Well, you know, how do you distinguish a false prophet from a true prophet? I don't know. Maybe the false prophet tells you what you want to hear.
I guess I
Mm.
would just add to that I think physical courage and mental courage are related, that there's a reason that we use one word for both, and that in the modern world, there's far less opportunity to manifest physical courage or to know what it would be like. And, you know, it's been much discussed, and I agree with the sense that, you know, the lack of war is both beautiful and in some ways demasculinizing for society, not having that as even a possibility on the horizon. And there, you know, there's plenty of things that girls and women do as well that requires physical courage, but it tends to look different. And in our disembodied, behind screens, especially for the last, you know, especially during COVID era, just, you know, aphysical lives, without having any sense of what physical courage might be or what physical risk might be, of course, we're now also more confused about mental courage. And so, you know, being told things like silence is violence and also speech is violence. So, you know, the whole thing just falls apart very quickly.
Before we go to our break and the Q&A, Jordan, I just want to come back to you on this because I'm not satisfied with the conversation we've had so far, and that's maybe because there is no answer. But I just feel like I've had so many conversations with people where I've said exactly the same thing to them. Lying is bad. It has consequences. If we carry on down this path, we will go to a very bad place, and we're already in a very bad place. And the answer is, yeah, you're just exaggerating. It's just the pendulum swinging the other way. It will swing back. Everything will be fine. And even if it's not, well, at least I get to survive today. You go and die. I'll survive today. What does one say to something like that?
They might be right. You know, you just can't tell, can you? I mean, let's say the pendulum does swing back. Well, maybe it swings back because people stopped it from swinging too far. But then the people who said it's going to swing back will say, well, we said it was going to swing back, and look, there it went. Well, that's why you can't, in some sense, make your moral determinations as like the truth is the best, well, provable, and for exactly the reasons that you just laid out. It's a decision you make at some point, and you weigh the evidence. You're either incoherent and all over the place, which is its own catastrophe, or you stake your life on a certain set of principles. You do that, you have to do one of those two things. You're either incoherent or you're coherent. If you're coherent, you stake your existence on some axiomatic principles. They're basically axioms of faith. And you have to decide what those are. And then you live out the consequences of that. And that's each individual soul's journey. And I'm not even sure you can convince people in some sense. I mean, you can talk to people and you can tell them what you think and you can let them make up their own mind. It's one thing I learned as a therapist, and I watch therapists on TV all the time. They're always telling their clients what to do. I didn't tell my clients what to do. I didn't know what the hell they should do. I mean, they were different people than me. And I didn't want to take ownership of their victories or responsibility for their defeats. You know, that's not a good thing. And so I was always trying to help them figure out what they should do. And, you know, insofar, I think as I've been successful in my lecturing capability, that's because I'm doing that for the people I'm talking to. I'm not saying you have to believe this, you know, it's people wrestle with their own conscience. But, you know, if you're forced to violate your conscience, something's up. Either your conscience is malfunctioning or the thing that's forcing you to violate it is becoming tyrannical. What are the other options?
It's very, very true. Right, we are going to take a very short advert break now from our sponsors. And what we will do is we're going to collate all of your questions that you want to ask Jordan and Heather. And then when we'll come back, we'll be able to ask as many of your questions as possible. We won't be able to get through all of them, but we will do our best to pick the ones that we can.
We'll see you in a few minutes, guys. Francis, do you like biscuits? Stupid question. If you like biscuits as much as him, you have to try Zingy Berry Bakery. They're a small family-run bakery that make award-winning sweet cookies and savory crackers. Francis will explain how many awards they've won, won't you, Francis? Their sumptuous cookies are made with whole grain oats and real butter. Their savory crackers are made with whole grain oats and are both wheat and dairy free. And they've got a brilliant offer. All you have to do is enter our code, which is of course triggered, on your first order, and you'll not only get 10% off, they'll give you free delivery as well. That's 10% off and free delivery on your first order with our code, which is triggered. Go to Zingy
Hey, Konstantin, do you like talented designers and tech developers from Latin America?
Not this again. I told you, we're not hiring your cousin.
Ay, Dios mío, keep Pedro out of this. I'm talking about an online tech platform for clients to hire highly skilled and vetted
think originally you asked me what my take on it, on the conversation so far, Harley. I don't know. They're saying a lot of different things. Yeah, but it'd be interesting to get your opinion about what you're saying with morality. That conversation is very long. I can already tell just by the yawn I just gave off. The morality conversation. Man. So I'm watching it right now, and they're still in a break. But when they're done with the break, I'll put the stream back on. I think I'll tell you where I disagree with you, Harley. Hold on, actually, they're back on. I'll speak after this.
Keys that's being used to accelerate it. What can we do about this, and how can we reverse it if we can?
Well, I don't think it's inevitable. So I think it's not a foregone conclusion by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, if you look at the United States, for example, there's a fair bit of power on both sides of the political spectrum, and the battle's raging, but it isn't obvious that one side has won. So, and I think the Americans have negotiated their way through worse crises than this. I mean, it isn't obvious to me that this is worse than, well, certainly not worse than the time that Nixon was president. That period of time, say from 66 to about 74, it was pretty, it was much like it is now, except worse, I would say. So I'm not hopeless about this. I think that, and I do think a lot of this is a consequence of radical technological transformation. That's a more unsettling phenomenon in some sense, but I don't really have any answers about what to do with that. So,
Francis, let me tack on to this a question. Maybe, Heather, you want to jump on this, because Sherry says, what do you guys think is the best way to peacefully protest against critical race theory and our tax-funded public schools? And it's part of the same conversation, I feel.
Yeah. I guess peacefully protest brings up images of people in the streets, and I don't think that is how CRT is going to get disappeared from the schools. I think that, well, I think we need our schools of ed back.
Good luck with that.
Yeah, and that's a long-term solution that is the only one that will stick. So in the moment, I imagine that, again, your inboxes may also look like mine in this regard, but I certainly hear from a lot of parents and teachers, both, whose kids are in schools, both K-12 and higher ed, but especially K-12, saying this is a disaster. What do we do? And I guess I would go back. It's not an operational answer, but I would go back to my answer from before and say, be assured that if you are seeing this, either as a parent or as a teacher or staff or administrator at some school that you are affiliated with, you are not the only one, and you're not the only one who's concerned. I feel certain, and it's impossible to do the numbers from where I'm sitting, but I feel certain that it's never just one person, and it's often a significant minority, and sometimes it's actually a majority of people at an institution who don't like what's happening, are putting their head down and just trying to do what they perceive as their job, or just trying to get their kids to the school because they don't feel like they can make trouble, but they're actually dying inside. They really cannot tolerate what is happening, and find each other, figure out some way to find each other. And this is one of the few places where I would say, like, I am with you, Jordan, on the hyper novel technology being a big part of the crisis that we're living through right now. And that's the thing that makes this different from Nixon era, right? Like, you know, it's just not like that because they didn't have social media. But one of the things that our hyper connected, hyper novel technology allows us to do is potentially find people and talk privately and establish some rapport and figure out what to do. And I think, you know, with regard to in the schools, know that there are many of us out here who see it and are, you know, doing what we can with bigger platforms, but figure out who it is, who else where you are can actually see this as well. And, you know, just start almost and this is not about CRT in schools, but like when I just engage, I'm here in Portland, Oregon, which is sort of like the epicenter of ridiculous in a lot of ways. And I love it. I love Portland. I love the people here. And there's just a tiny minority of yahoos who are just driving the narrative and driving a lot of chaos here. And when I talk to a barista, a waitress, you know, the person at the front desk at physical therapy, you know, when I just talk to any, you know, at UPS, whatever, and just give any indication when they say something standard and generic that I don't actually fit into the standard generic model that they're assuming is what you have to do small talk now, almost everyone responds with relief and wants to have a real conversation. Almost everyone. I think that actually it's a
Hey Adam, this is Jamie. I'm currently in the middle of a live stream. I was trying to do a reschedule for later after 4 if you're still available. It's a little short
I
noise.
wouldn't
I'm sorry about
underestimate the
that.
utility of writing a letter. Write a letter to the school board. At least you don't even have to send it. At least you get your arguments down and articulate them. That's something. And then maybe once you do that, you know, you can write the letter. Then you let it sit for a week and you can think about it. Make sure you got your words right as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, let's do
And, you know, we do have
let's
political
do
structures. People aren't involved in them, and I got involved in political structures in Canada a bit when I was younger, and they're so starving for people's participation that it's beyond belief. And so you can make an effect locally in your community or in your state or province or nationally for that matter, if you want to put in the time. So those institutions, well, that's what we have. And so unless you want to generate new institutions, you try using those.
I bet.
People
By
think
the
they won't
way,
listen
I
to
didn't
them.
air it, but
Yeah, sometimes they
my
don't, but
fiance's
letters
mom,
have more effect
she had an
than you think.
allergic reaction to it.
So
I thought you would
that's
want to hear
something, at
that.
least, isn't it?
I'm not
It's
exactly
gonna
sh-
expose you to a tremendous amount
I
of
don't
noise,
know.
especially if you word it carefully and you write before you.
I mean,
so
it's also
angry that you can't
difficult
control
to
yourself.
explain whether
In England, we
whether
love
it's
a
a
strongly
natural
worded
allergic
letter.
reaction because she actually
It's a
got the
national
jab.
pastime,
It is a
really.
national pastime to find something that mildly pisses us off.
Yeah,
and then
we
write
we talked it out. I told her
Yes,
the
well, thank God
reality
for
of what's
England,
happening.
so-
I told her things she can use to combat what's in there. So
So
she's
the
not.
next question is
She's
from a
not.
rather
She's
charmingly named
fairly like
Zoe
I've given
Redback.
her
It's a
the
dreadful
worst
name,
of
but it's
the
a good
news
question.
already, and she's
Do
already
all
taking
big brands
steps
have the
to
downside
prevent
that we overthink
the worst
things
case
that involve
scenario, but,
behavior
um,
contradictory to our nature, e.g., veganism and gender, etc. So over to you, Heather, and then we'll go to Jordan with that one.
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's a trade-off there.
That's
And,
probably what it is.
just at the most
And
banal level.
I'll
they're
probably
really
get back to
expensive
her
to
on
run.
that, but
You know, our brains are the most expensive
it's just-
organ in the body to run. And
I hope not.
once we
I hope
started-
not as well. I mean,
once we
I've
started
found
finding
people
out
in
ways
grocery
to
stores and given
food, and
them
we need to spend more time getting food,
all kinds of
spend time
protocols
figuring out
against
new
that.
technologies in order
Like
to
I
get
found
food
this
to be
random
more
lady
accessible to us and start
yesterday,
cooking, for instance.
and I talked to her
And
about a
you get
protocol that
you
could be
get
used
sort of
that
it's
is
a
like
cascade of events that is really hard to stop at the point that you start going down, we're going to solve this intellectually. On the other hand,
But they do have those
we don't tend
protocols
to
out
solve
there,
things
but
with brute force. We're not the brawniest ape or primate or mammal. That's not what we do. So, is there a trade-off? Yes. Can we figure out how?
See, that's
to
good enough.
feel
See,
the
for
broken
that, so
record?
even the people who
But,
are dumb enough to get
can
the
we
shot
return
at
ourselves to something of an integrated, coherent whole, and remember that we are actually fully embodied beings with emotion in addition, fully embodied with emotion and not just analysis and intellect. It's not just the logic and the words and the,
You can use borax on the nanoparticles.
right? It's, we're here in these bodies, going out into nature, feeling all of our senses and having a sense of awe sometimes, of love, of anger, of
Yeah, I told her about
even.
that.
All of these
It was a
are
lady I was
qualities of
talking to.
human,
She said her whole
and
family's
it is, I
detoxing
think, again, a
because
failure that is best described
because
as
they had
perfectionist to
mold
say,
poisoning in their
that's,
house or
our
something
big
like
brains is
that.
what we are. It's
And I
the
kind
only
of
thing
told
we are,
her.
that's what
She
makes
said
us
she
human.
she
No,
didn't want to
it's
take the
all
shot,
of
but
this.
she
It's
took
the
it
integration
anyway. And
of
I
all
was like,
parts that makes us
okay.
human.
Like I didn't judge her or
The
anything. It's
trade-offs
like,
for
okay,
sure,
so if you're
how to evade the
you want to
trade-offs
combat
in a
whatever
perfect
happens
way,
towards
but
that shot, because I
remembering
told her
we
it's
are
experimental, and she's like, I know.
more than the sum of our
And
parts.
she said her husband was in the military, so I'm guessing he kind of just probably coerced her to do it.
And
But a lot
Jordan,
of
what was
times
your
the
view on this
wives,
question?
they'll
Well,
just go
you
along
guys
with
kind
it,
of pointed to it.
knowing they don't want to do it.
We're the only creatures that have discovered our temporal finitude. In an
Absolutely,
explicit
man.
sense.
Absolutely.
Something akin to grief.
At least
And
I
maybe
can.
grief itself. There isn't a lot of evidence that they conceptualize themselves as
This
finite
shit's
beings.
about to pop
That's
off,
a-
man.
that's
This
a big
is this
difference,
is
and
the
it might be a
crazy.
fatal
This
difference
is
in some
probably
sense.
the greatest thing I'll see in my
Religious
lifetime.
stories like the story of Adam and Eve. When our eyes were opened, we discovered that we were going to die.
No.
And that's the fall, essentially. And we've never recovered from that. And you can view the whole Bible, in some sense, as an attempt to redress that problem.
I've heard about the
story
dong,
goes
yeah.
something like, well, a sufficiently
Oh, Sam.
noble ethical endeavor might be sufficient to remove the sting of death. And maybe that's true. So the big brain has a price, right? We're very self-conscious, and that's great in some sense because we're aware of who we are. But it's not like it's not a fall. It's a fall, right? For the writers of the Bible, that was the beginning of history, was the dawn of self-consciousness. And history is, in some sense,
Yeah, I mean, they already have certain systems in
culture that
place.
protects us
Sometimes
from
just
our
wait
death.
for it to happen.
So, on the upside, we live a long time, and our lives are less.
Yeah,
selfish,
absolutely.
right?
That's part of the reason why I'm not really
Those
financial.
animals,
I'm not like a
And
super
so forth,
financial savvy. The
gain,
guys
right?
who are
no
working with the
price.
market to kind of
It's
watch
obvious that we can know the
manipulations up
price.
and
It's
down
not obvious.
and hedge their bets. I'm not with that, and I'm not against the guys who
former
do it.
guest of the show,
But I already
Michaela
know
Peterson,
whatever's
says,
there,
"Go Dad,"
whatever's
in
in
the
my
chat.
ledger,
So Michaela, good
it's
to see you
already,
again.
it's basically
Also,
already
if
coming.
you're
I'm
surprised
already
to
aware
discover
of
you
it.
can ask questions, we mentioned at the beginning, there's a link in the bottom. You can send us a PayPal, send a super chat, and we'll get to your question if we possibly can. Robin asked a
I'm
question,
curious how
coming
many
back to the
people are
very
having this
beginning of our
conversation
discussion,
right
which
now.
is the
I bet
breakdown of the
NSA
family.
is
There
having a field day,
quite a
man.
persuasive argument, particularly I think it's more likely to be on the political
Yeah.
right, that the introduction of the welfare state
Yeah, man.
in
This
the
is.
United
I think
States
I've
is
heard
what
that
fueled
we could
the
see a
breakdown of
Biden
the
arrest in a
family. Do
week.
either of you have any strong feelings or thoughts on that issue?
That's if that happens, that's going to be
Well, as a
fascinating.
conservative, in some sense, which I think I became, at least in part, because I was a social
What's it?
scientist and learned about the law of unintended consequences.
Oh, okay.
You mess with complex functional systems.
Oh well, man, we got a lot. We got a lot
If
to
you
talk
think
about.
that
It
your
sounds like.
well-meaning intervention is going to have the positive effect that you think it will, and only that effect, you're blinded
do
by
it
your
after
own ignorance
6?
of your ignorance. It's a really profound form of ignorance.
All right,
And
let's
so
do it at 7.
I think there were more factors driving the breakdown of the family. And we should also point out, it's like, well, what do you mean by the breakdown of the family? If you lived in the 1900s or the 1800s, the late 1800s, let's say, the probability that you were going to lose a parent before the age of 10, before you were the age of 10, was pretty damn high. And so the intact two-parent family with kids that live and parents that live, you know, for a substantial amount of time is a relatively novel and modern phenomenon. Certainly it's a 20th century phenomenon as far as we can tell. So,
but Jordan, I would argue that, yeah, and obviously I wouldn't argue with you about it, but because you're actually an expert on this, but psychologically, I would imagine the impact of losing a parent to a natural cause like disease or whatever is different.
Yeah, it should probably just
the
be open
experience
in,
of
because I can already
feeling that
tell
your-
just by
your dad,
listening we
let's
have
say,
a
walked
lot
out
to
on you
talk
before
about.
you've even born.
well,
That gets
look,
processed
you
in a
could
different way.
decompose that a lot of ways. You know, I don't know if you can make a blanket case that it's worse to have a father who leaves or one that dies. Those are both pretty bad.
Sure.
There is less of a sense of perhaps the risk of feeling that it's your fault or that something could have been done about it, arguably. But putting that aside, like I think if you look at the data on the
Oh, well, we're not going to
children,
have a choice. We're going to
the
see it's
evidence
kind
that
of going to be
children
front loaded
who have
and the
intact
honest all at
two-sex,
once. We're not really
two-parent
going to have a
families
choice.
do better is overwhelming. Now, I don't think we know enough.
Yeah,
to
dude,
specify
you know,
the
I've
fact that
wanted-
it has to be two sex, like we, you know, a male.
You
and
know
a
what's
female.
funny?
I
You know, the
suspect
first
that
thing I'm
that's
going to
the
get
case for a variety of
whenever
complex
I
reasons. That
recognize
doesn't mean
how
that
much
two
is in
people
my
of the
account
same
on people
sex
who've been
couldn't make a
trading
good
me
go of
for
it.
my
It
whole
also
life.
doesn't mean that single parents can't make
Guess.
a go of it. But on aggregate,
I'm going to
it's
get
better
a
to have mother and
motorcycle
father.
and some gear.
I think the reasons for that are self-evident, actually. It's like, well, because how are you going to model your masculinity?
I'm gonna get some
from
gear,
if you're a
motorcycle.
boy,
I may
and
even go
femininity
through the
from if
training.
You're a girl. You'll get echoes of that.
Get a
in
nice
your
parking lot.
Same-sex parent, but it's not enough for creatures that are as developmentally complex as us. And so, it's kind of stunning to me that this is a discussion that we actually have to have. It's like, well.
Absolutely. I need a new kind of therapy, man. That's
relationship to the
that's
patriarchal structure of the
open road.
nuclear family. It's like, I don't know how twisted you have to be to think that a man's commitment long term,
Pretty much. I'll consider that a victory lap.
child raising over multiple decades is an expression.
Dude,
of his desire for
absolutely.
arbitrary
That'd be
patriarchal power.
cool.
That's preposterous. It's exactly the opposite. Obviously. So the
GoPros.
fact that I can't believe that we're actually.
Yeah, I'm thinking.
confused about
So
this.
my fiance's dad,
Where
he
is the
he has a
selfish
Harley.
advantage precisely?
So
The selfish
either just
advantage.
with you or just have a big group. That'd be
The
cool.
selfish
I mean, I
advantage
have
is
to learn how to ride a
manifested by
motorcycle first.
They mate promiscuously, like mosquitoes, and their offspring live or die, and that's how it is. And
Yeah,
there's a
man.
niche for that.
We're close to a
And that's
victory.
the
This
arbitrary
is
expression of
this
power.
is. I mean, I'm gonna have to be
So,
the one to
We're so
explain this
demented
shit
about
to the people
so
in
many
my
fundamental
family.
things that it just staggers.
So,
me. We swallow.
I mean, I'm
things that
probably.
aren't
I think I'm the only person. Now, my mom, I noticed she has
incomplete
really
theories.
good
They're
intuition, so she
absolute
picked up on it.
preposterous falsehoods.
But
And
she
yet,
doesn't know the
to
facts, but
oppose
her
them means that
intuition
there's
is
something
good.
wrong
So
with
she
you
she kind of knows
politically.
that there's some things going
I
on,
just
but she
can't see
doesn't
how
know
you can
exactly
make a
what it
case
is.
that on aggregate, a family without a father and a mother is better than or equal to a family that has both. How can that possibly be true?
You don't have to make a case. You just have to say that the people who do make that case are bad people. which is
And I
what
know
happens.
there's a lot of rain.
Heather, do you want to weigh in on
There's
this?
a lot of weather warfare
First,
going on.
I'm just delighted.
in,
I've never
China
heard the
right now.
promiscuous mating system identified as being like mosquitoes before, Jordan, so that made me laugh. The one
Oh,
thing that
yeah.
I would add, and I basically
that's what I was getting at.
is that I think I don't see a reason to expect. I think that
You know, I'm kind of wondering if
I
they're
agree
going to
with
get
what
rid
you
of
said,
that obelisk
that all
in
else being equal,
DC, if that's going to be the
two
last
parents
thing they
is
take
one,
down.
and two parents of
Because you know you have
opposite sex,
the.
is going to provide more diverse input to developing
No,
children.
I actually have to
And
look into that.
therefore, if you have a loving relationship between two women or between two men who are raising children, then one thing in their favor is they had to really, really want those children, whereas many heterosexual parents end up parents without necessarily wanting kids, right? You can happen into parenthood being hetero.
Oh shit! Wait, I
If you're
lied.
homosexual.
Actually,
But I think
I
it's
was
more
unprivy to
important if
information
you're
that
raising
said,
children,
I think
as a homosexual couple
one
of
of the
either
defense
sex, to make
agencies
sure
said,
that you
"Hey,
have
there's a
adults
training
around that
exercise
sense
going on
of
in Washington D.C.
so
Don't
that
be
they are
alarmed."
providing some kind of
So yeah,
model
that's
to the children
I've
of
heard
what it
about
is
that.
to be the other.
I didn't know
to
what
be
you were
the other
talking about at
sex.
first,
And
but
that's,
I
you know,
saw a
this is not
message
some
from
sort
I
of
don't remember
biased
which department it
social
was from,
imagining
but
that, like, all men
yeah,
are like this
it's
and all
popping
women are like
off.
this, but that
I mean, it's
there are
it's gonna
different
be
reasons that are
sad too for a lot of people. A lot of
even
people are gonna be
down
really
to,
angry, but
on average, women being more agreeable than men, and you know, just seeing what that looks like in real time, like the more exposure to the more diverse kinds of people.
yeah, dude. Like
you give your children,
I
the more
had
likely
a
they are to be
pasta
able
the
to
other
wade through
day.
life later
I had
on.
more
And
gallons in the
especially
pasta.
if your
I actually
if their
saw
neighbor
it,
home only
pulled
has
it
men
out,
or only has
and
women,
watched the thing.
make sure you introduce them to some women or men.
I
Like,
can give you an example of that. It's a bit offside, but not exactly. Girls with brothers are less likely to suffer sexual assault.
Right.
Why?
I mean, this one wasn't
hard to
even
say
small.
exactly, but
Like
it's
it
probably
was
because
so obvious to my eyes, and it was
the-
magnetic. Because when I got a
Their
fork
exposure to men
and I put it up to it,
from an early age
the
allows
thing,
them
like,
to
it has
read
like
social
little,
situations more
like
carefully,
it has little magnets
more
on like
accurately. It's
the little
something
out. It
I'm
looks
sure I'll
basically like a centipede,
lambasted for this, but that is a fact.
and it has like little
So-
dots, and the
And
dots
Is it
I
also
think are
not
magnetic,
about
so it can
the
move.
thing
Men
of
and women.
protection?
It was really,
Is it
it
not also the
really
fact that
unnerved me to the point
they're
where I took
perceived
the
as
whole
having
pasta and
protection?
dumped it in a
You know,
trash
it
can.
works
By other
later
men?
in
Like,
life.
I wanted to vomit. It was that bad.
It's a protracted effect.
Mm.
So, you know, that might be part
But
of
I
it.
mean, it's in
It
everything.
seems to
Yeah.
be longer lasting than that. It's not
But
so
there's
preposterous
learning.
to claim that you're more likely to deal with people that you understand more deeply, deal, you know, effectively with people that you understand more deeply.
Right.
How
Mhm.
dare you, sir?
Yeah, well,
What an extraordinary
I-
statement.
I do think it's an indication of how confused we are by how much change is occurring, that all these things have become open to question. It might also be the case that, you know, that's a consequence of, well, a university education that isn't sufficiently cognizant of the debt that it owes to the past.
No, and I guess actually picking up on something that you said earlier with regard to what's
Wait,
going on at
you said
universities,
water-based
I think,
alcohol?
you know, you indicated that people who are concerned about their school boards could fill those spots because people are hungry. Like the political environment is hungry for people at that level, and I think this is part of what happened in higher ed, that no one who didn't have to went and pursued governance. You know, we're all expected, all us academics are expected to do a certain amount of governance, but if you were one of the scientists with big grants, you normally got an exemption. Or if you otherwise had a lot
Yeah,
going
I
on,
mean,
that was
you know me
how
as a male. I
universities
mean, one of the
behaved.
things I've been trying to
You don't
do
have
is
to
to
do the governance.
exercise
So who was
because,
left in all the
you know,
governance
I've noticed
spots?
that I've been passive
The
for a
people who
very
are
large
otherwise
portion of my
uninterested
life,
or
and I've always kind of
incapable
cracked it up
of
as to
bringing
be, no,
new
I'm just a very
ideas
passive
to the
person.
university,
But
and
I don't really
frankly, to
think
some
that's the
degree, who were
case. I
driven
don't
to bring ideology
necessarily
in.
think that's true
And so,
anymore.
you know, we absolutely need people who are creative and analytical and logical and compassionate and actually know something and know how to communicate it and believe in the humanity of other people to be in positions on school boards and in governance. And, you know, the work that doesn't feel like almost anyone's highest and best use, but that we need real good people in those positions.
And the next question is by another awful name. He's actually a big fan
Stop
of
slagging off our audience.
His name is I'll Fight You Naked. Come on. That's not a good name. I don't know if that says more about him or the channel. Anyway, but it's a very good question. His question is, women seem more vulnerable to the woke religion, I think because it hijacks the mama bear circuits. Is there any psychological intervention or an evolutionary perspective that could be used to at least curtail this? And that's over to you, Heather, and then Jordan.
Yeah. Great question. I'm actually
All
familiar
right,
with
man.
I'll
I
Fight
know
You
I'm
Naked
gonna
as
be on.
well.
I know I'm gonna be
Thank
talking
you
to you for
for
hours. I
arguing
gotta
as
get
well.
back to this live
I'm
stream.
assuming it's
I'll
a
see you
he,
Monday
right?
at
With that
7.
name
Yeah.
somehow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
It's
See
not a
you.
very feminine approach, is it, Heather?
No, not much. Not so much. women, both, to go back to what I was saying, right at the beginning of our time together today,
Oh shit.
women being more likely to engage through covert competitive means than men with their overt competitive means. And also being more likely to be agreeable, which is related but not the same thing, are, and a third thing, more likely to have their entire world wrapped up in their social universe, as opposed to men who are more likely to also say have a shop, be tinkering, like have something else going on. All of those things, I think, make women more susceptible to groupthink, to social pressure, and to actually, at the point that they have adopted some new ideology, or even just a piece of it, to feeling compelled to spread it to others. And I wouldn't actually put it, I feel like Mama Bear, to the degree that that's something that we can all immediately grok what that means, is one of the best and frankly, I don't think capturable pieces of womanhood. That, protection of your children, and of course fathers do this too, but protection of your children at all costs is actually what I think we need to be finding. I was just actually talking with Brett about this last night. Like, we need to get the mothers to discover what it is that is being done to the children. And once the mothers stand up and say, actually, no, you don't get my kids. You do not get to do that to my kids. That is the thing that will make women disagreeable. And what we need is disagreeability. We need people to stand against the crowd enough that then the people who won't go disagreeable say, oh, wait, but there's a lot of people I like and respect who are going this way, so I don't have to be disagreeable to go this way. I'm going to follow that new line over there. And it's going to be the one that is actually honest and honorable and protective of children and allows us, freedom of expression and exploration of ideas.
Yeah, agreeable means that you like your kin, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're that fond of perceived predators.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that's
Right.
a weird thing. We don't understand. You think, well, you love your family, therefore you're a loving person. It's like, no, wait a minute. It's not that simple. You love your family. Well, what do you do when you perceive a threat to them? You don't love the threat and love your family at the same time. That's very unlikely. And so agreeableness, a very complicated personality dimension. It has marked advantages and disadvantages at every position along the distribution. Like disagreeable people are rather self-centered, let's say, and they have a tendency to be, in the extreme, they have a tendency to be antisocial. But there's pathologies associated with extremely high levels of agreeableness too. And we don't understand how that will manifest itself precisely in the political realm, because this is all new territory in some sense. So what does female political pathology look like? Well, it doesn't exist. It's like, oh, right, sure. Mm-hmm. No, that's wrong. We know that the covert kinds of aggression that Heather was talking about, it's a reputation destruction that characterizes feminine aggression. And if what's the joke from The Simpsons? There's nothing meaner than a roving pack of 13-year-old girls. and the boys, and my daughter used to comment on this now and then. My son would have a fight with one of his friends. They'd actually have a fight and then they'd make up. But if the girls got their knickers in a knot, let's say, Jesus, all hell would break loose for a long time, and often on social media. So, is it reasonable to see some of this reputation destruction culture as a manifestation of female political pathology? It's like, I don't know, but I do know that, because I've studied antisocial behavior and I've been in touch with leading experts in that area, that is the most extreme form of female aggression. And so, and it scales. That's the thing that's interesting about it. You can't punch someone on Twitter, much as you might want to, but you can sure savage their reputation. And so it scales. And we don't know what to make of that, but to turn a blind eye to it seems to me to be prematurely foolish.
Heather, let me just follow up before I go to a question. I want to talk a little bit more about this. You've written in the past about toxic femininity, which I think is what Jordan is alluding to a little bit there. Do you think, this obsession with toxic masculinity and toxic, do you think that's the useful frame, or do we need to de-sex this and just go, there are some behaviors that are productive and some behaviors that are unproductive, and we just need to try and steer society towards the productive ones, rather than sort of focusing on which sex it's more in tune with?
No, I actually, so obviously the pointing of the finger at any kind of masculinity and declaring it toxic is a disaster and foolish, and often far worse than foolish, like actually kind of diabolical behavior. And there will be places, I would say, where approaching it without reference to the sex that tends to engage in a particular thing will be useful. But there is utility in understanding that sex roles have been around for millions of years, and that men are more likely to engage in competitive interactions overtly in front of you, where you can see it, and when it's over and you know it. And women are more likely to engage in competitive interactions covertly, behind the scenes, behind the people involved perhaps, and you may not even know that you're playing. And those different dynamics, it's not that women can't do the overt thing and men can't do the covert thing, but understanding that there's actually a sort of evolutionary basis for the types of hierarchy and competition that men and women engage in, and that they are different, is, I think, important. And it's not because we want to reify what's male and what's female, but because we want to understand so that we can move past the regressive parts of it, and those that we can't move past, understand them, so that we can actually create some kind of, frankly, shared hierarchy, so that we all can work together without pretending that the male way of doing things is always wrong, and therefore it's going to be the female way, and we can't even point out when there's a pathology there, as Jordan is pointing out, or vice versa. We need to integrate the best of the male typical approach and the female typical approach, and I don't know exactly what that looks like, but pretending that there's no difference isn't the right way. I'm sure of that.
Well, attempting to integrate them would be a start, and we seem to be quite far off that at the moment. But let me ask this question. It's from Important John, another great name. His question really talks about, there's obviously a lot of what you might call conspiracy theories floating around at the moment. The idea that COVID was created by Bill Gates and all this other stuff. And Heather, I know that there are some conspiracies which have now increasingly turn out to be actually true. Lab leak is something we'll be talking with Brett about on Tuesday. But from a psychological perspective, Jordan, what is the appeal of a conspiratorial view of the world? Why are people drawn to conspiracies?
I think it's often a manifestation of low agreeableness, distrust. It's simple and explanatory, so that's helpful. We tend to personify things. It's easy to see malevolence and intent where there's just ignorance and randomness. And because it's important to identify malevolent intent, we might have a tendency to over-perceive it, especially in the out-group, let's say. But I think there's additional factors at play right now. Like, it's not that easy to distinguish conspiratorial thinking from just creative thinking, right? So there's something happens. There's a bunch of explanations why it might happen. Now, you might have a cockeyed conspiratorial version, and then you go talk to your friends and your family, and they sort of tune you in. But let's say it's COVID and you're isolated. Well, every one of us has got a proclivity towards our own particular form of insanity. Like, we blow out at our weakest point when we're stressed. And the way that we deal with that is by banging ourselves up against other people. It's like, what do you think of this? I think that's stupid. Oh, okay, well, maybe I'll have to go rethink it. Well, that's part of what keeps our conspiratorial thinking under wraps, right? We have to share it with other people. And if they think it's preposterous, then we go back and rethink it. It's distributed cognition in the social space. Now you can find like-minded people for your conspiracy instantly. And they're not even real people. Often they're disembodied. And so we also have no idea what that's doing to human, social, cognitive, political thinking. We don't know. And that's another consequence of this radical transformation in technology. We don't even know what it does to people to have to speak to speak over video instead of in person. What that does to discourse. We have no idea what Twitter does to thought. You have to compress your thought into, a minimum number of or maximum number of characters. Well, does that bias you towards the expression of impulsive aggression? Kind of looks like it. Does it increase the probability that you're going to speak out kind of in the privacy of your own cocoon, like you're behind the wheel of an automobile and shielded when something irritates you? Could easily be. These are mass communication networks with huge effects, and we have no idea about what they do to us psychologically. And we'll never figure it out, because by the time we study it, they'll have transformed into something completely different. So it's tough. It's a tough one.
Heather?
I agree.
Don't assume malevolence where you can assume ignorance.
Yeah,
That's a good mental hygiene approach to conspiratorial thinking. It's probably stupidity.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just, this isn't and also not following from that, and also, and I know you're having a conversation, as you said, with Brad on Tuesday. Currently, alternative approaches to thinking through what we are being told are being branded as conspiracy as a way to shut down the conversation.
Right.
And so this is the death of science. This is exactly the same people who are branding things conspiracy theory are saying #follow the science. And these aren't people who would recognize a hypothesis that was alternative to the only one that they're allowing us to talk about if it hadn't face. So, there's a weaponization of words, again, but specifically, as of 5-10 years ago, we all knew that we were most afraid of being called racist. And now it's understood that you certainly don't want to be called a conspiracy theorist. But hey, remember that every big idea, and probably most of the small ones too, that we now understand to be true, were once promoted by one or a couple of people, and they were roundly mocked and perhaps stigmatized and perhaps even ostracized or even executed for even saying the thing. And so, yes, Lab Leak is a perfect example, and there are more in COVID space, and there are more all the time. And what social media does is it gives the bullhorn to the orthodoxy, to those who are claiming they have no power at all, but actually have the power to shout down any dissent to the reigning narrative.
If you look at the way science works, you think about it this way: well-meaning people doing everything they possibly can to rein their egos in, generate hypotheses about why something happens. 99 out of 100 times they're wrong. Right? And now, if you're right 1% of the time, and that's cumulative, man, your knowledge is progressing so damn fast, you can't even keep up with it. But your error rate is still 99%. And that's with the best method we possibly have to detect, some facet of the truth. In the political space, well, it's much harder. So the error rate is going to be much, much greater. And so, and of course, everybody's tails in a knot because they've been locked down for a year and a half. And God only knows how insane we are because of that and what the consequence of that's going to be. I mean, I certainly don't think that the lockdown is going to result in net life saving. I doubt that very much. Now, we'll probably never have the data. And I can understand that the Western world, and the rest of the world for that matter, didn't want to see their medical system completely swamped. But I doubt very much that we save people. We'll see. I don't know.
We save some people at the cost of others, is what you mean.
We save some people in the short term at the cost of many others in the long run.
Agreed.
And look, those sorts of trade-offs, we make those sorts of trade-offs because that immediately evident catastrophe, mortality, is a lot more difficult to deal with psychologically than, a 5% increase in the rate of alcoholism or something like that, which is basically invisible. I'm not castigating the people who did this. Well, the people who did this were us, so castigate away.
And we have time for one last question.
We've got a couple, actually. We started late, remember?
Oh, yeah, we did start late. So I will leave that question. I'll ask it now. It's the most important question of our time. It's from Ilana. And we ask this to all our guests on the live shows. Heather and Jordan, what's your favourite biscuit and why?
Biscuit?
Yes.
Cookie.
Would you like to take this one first, Jordan?
Well, at the moment, I'm still mostly eating a carnivore diet, so I have these meat chips that are substitute for everything that might vaguely be dessert-like. So, I mean, if I unwarped image of strawberry cheesecake with chocolate drizzling comes to mind, but that's not precisely a cookie. It's just an indication of my state of deprivation, having endured this bloody diet for so long.
Heather?
Cookie.
I think it's probably the most American answer, but a good chewy chocolate chip cookie is probably the best. Still warm from the oven, a little crisp on the edges, melty on the inside. It's pretty good.
You could be a
Cinnamon buns
voiceover
are up there
artist.
too, as far as I'm concerned.
We're gonna let's stop because Jordan looks like he's about to go off his diet. The way he was vigorously nodding there. Listen, guys, before we ask you the last question, can I just thank you both from the bottom of our hearts for joining us, for having this conversation. It's been an absolute pleasure. Our audience have been so grateful that we've been able to host it. So thank you, Jordan, and thank you, Heather, for coming on the show. It's been an absolute pleasure, and I hope we can do it again sometime. Francis, do you want to ask? Maybe we can end on a positive. Shall we ask this one from April?
This is from April, and it's the question is, April Hill, how we avoid apathy, but also not cave into negative thought when informed of all that is wrong.
Basically, how do you avoid apathy if you watch Trigonometry, is the question.
Early in the pandemic, when Brett and I started live streaming, I started saying at the end, get outside. And that is the thing that I do to avoid apathy, is as much as, you know, I learned from you guys and Jordan, like all of you and many others, still the less time on the screens, the better. And that even holds for just taking in text. I still prefer to read through, you know, actual books, not on screens. And I read a lot, but the more time I'm outside, actually, you know, pursuing speed in my case, because I just love going fast outside in nature and also being totally still outside in nature and letting nature come alive around me. That gives a renewed sense of meaning and purpose and, frankly, direction, such that I can come back inside to this kind of work with less apathy and more purpose.
Jordan?
Well, I probably find most of what's renewing in my relationships with my family and friends. And so, you know, to the degree that I'm able to engage in that, that's almost always to the good. So apathy as such, well, I find inactivity much more horrifying than activity. So I don't know how to answer the question in a broader sense, because I just can't stand not being engaged in something. And so I guess in some sense that question doesn't come up. If it's hopelessness, well, you know, in some sense things are hopeless, but you move ahead regardless. And that's the nature of life, isn't it? You know that in the final analysis, in some sense, it's hopeless. You're going to disappear. I don't mean to be pessimistic about that, but it does speak to things we've already talked about in this episode. And you persevere to the degree that you're capable of, because that's the alternative is far worse than that. Mm-hmm. So, and not just for you, for everyone else around you as well. So.
Well, I said let's finish on a high. We didn't quite get there, but
I sure put the kibosh on that.
We should have finished with the biscuit question. I knew it.
I knew it. Guys, thank you so much for speaking with us. It's been an absolute pleasure. And thank you all for watching, with being here with us, asking the questions. As you know, we will be back on Tuesday with Brett Weinstein talking about lab leak and COVID and many other things. But for now, let's say again, thank you to Jordan Peterson. Thank you to Heather Hying. And thank you for watching. And we will see you very soon with another episode or Raw Show. All of them go out at 7 p.m. UK time.
Take care. See you soon, guys.
We hope you've enjoyed this incredible interview. Remember to subscribe and hit the bell button so that you never miss.
So for anyone that's still here, there's a lot that was said. particularly the thing that stuck out to me the most was the conversation about morality. Also, Heather brought up a good point about maternal instincts and how to essentially override the female proclivity to be agreeable. And I thought that was pretty important for the conversation we're having. I think overriding that agreeableness is one of the ways we combat feminism. We have to convince women that there are children, there's danger to our children, and the danger is in that movement. And if we could kind of put the red target on that movement through maternal instincts, get creative on how to do that. I mean, there's different ways. One way I would say is daycares. The dangers of going to a daycare or having a kid go to a daycare is they could be indoctrinated. They can be, I think it'd be significantly more difficult for a molestation in that. But there's a lot of dangers in terms of they could get sick. They could, it's not necessarily like mortal danger, but also the thing is the kid won't be able to receive the love of the mother. There's a lot of different angles you can go to. So outside of the daycare, in the school, the kid could be indoctrinated. The kid could be assaulted by the kid. There's a lot of dangers in terms of like how teachers treat males and also treat students that they don't like. So even if it's a little girl as well, I think the most effective thing that we have to get women in a more disagreeable attitude towards a lot of these movements that we have in the mainstream is through their maternal instinct. And I'm pretty glad that Heather brought that up. That's a super important point, I think. I don't know if y'all are still in here, but Harley, you said morality is a human construct, and you were going further with that. I'd kind of like to talk to you about it because I think that there's a little bit more to that. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with it. I would word it in a different way because I think it's right to a certain degree, but I think for me personally, I would word it a different way. I would interpret it. I would interpret what you're saying a different way. Because I don't think survival. I think survival is the last line. It's the last. I think there's priorities in life, and I think once it gets down to survival, then it's about survival. But everything above that, that's higher order thinking and higher levels of being. It's not. Everything isn't predicated off of or survival. It doesn't. I think survival has the last word, but I don't think I think we've moved past the primitive need to survive, and we've gotten to the point where we can create academia and education, and we could have leisure time. Leisure time wasn't something we always had, so that's my going forward with that a little bit. So y'all, just a little update. I got a live stream coming on Monday, I think at 7. We're going to talk about conspiracy theories. We're going to go into all kinds of interesting stuff, and I'll do an intro live stream to it maybe. But I have a guest coming on that's going to be cool. And also it'd be kind of cool to get someone else to come on that I usually have on here as well. But yeah, I might stream. I don't know. I don't want to get into something I know I'm not gonna do. I was contemplating streaming again later today. But I don't have anything to talk about, so not immediately. But that whole thing that Heather brought up about the maternal instincts and using that to override agreeableness, I think that's a big key to this, to solving this issue. Convincing the mothers of who the enemy is to their own children. That's one of the things I think where when women recognize a threat to their children, there's really no stopping them. They move into a league of their own. I think that's a very powerful instinct. And I think we need to capitalize on that instinct for the greater good. Because right now, feminism is capitalizing on vanity. It's capitalizing on the vanity of women, and it's capitalizing on the small amount of men who advocate it in order to get validation from women. So if it can capitalize on that, I think we can at least capitalize on, we can use our heads and think about something, paint the target on something and say, hey, you see your kid? There you go. That's the enemy to your kid. Maybe not today, but 10, 20 years down the road, that's going to be the enemy. I know there's a trend I've noticed with mothers. There's a trend I've noticed with, oh boy, you see a deer? You want to attack a deer? There is no deer. Okay, that's good. Anyways, I noticed there's a trend with women in the red pill who either had a son or an uncle or a brother or even a husband. But I think it's typically a son or maybe a brother, a close kin, who has succumbed to a lot of social structures that were kind of working against them, and they didn't see a way out. So whatever happened, I think the females in those situations kind of saw a different side than what they're being told. And those are the ones who kind of broke the mold. So I say that to kind of go along with what she was saying about how female maternal instincts can actually cause a woman to go against the group mores. And that's a mechanism we need to utilize. Ironically, feminism isn't using that. Feminism isn't using that type of engine. It's using a vanity engine, and it's using a ego engine. If we use the maternal engine, that's extremely strong. So, I mean, in the past we had we were using paternalism. Paternalism was the male engine for building society and raising families, right? Now, what's kind of funny to me is we have this whole untapped reservoir of instincts we could use against those movements. Why not? Let's use them. I don't know. Anybody got any opinions on that? If not, I think I don't really have any videos to play here. I don't have a lot of opinions on it. There's a lot that can be unpacked with this live stream or with the recording. It went better than I thought. So I was kind of shitting on the lady the first time I heard her. She seems like she's having an interesting metamorphosis. I think she's one of the more lucky women to be able to have a conversation within the realm of the intellectual giants that she's speaking with, because a lot of women, I'm saying they don't have that opportunity to speak to people who are very articulate. So I think she's very fortunate to speak to those gentlemen and the people, the group of people she's in, her peers, to be able to have those conversations and grow from them. She's pretty fortunate, in my opinion. So I think I got maybe 2 live streams coming. I'm not going to try to be on as much as I'm going to try to get off the computer as much as possible. Not taking like a week hiatus or anything, but As you can already see, this is a 2-hour stream because of the video, because of the live we had. But yeah, this one was good. There's a lot to unpack, and I'm pretty much done. So I think I'm gonna go clean a room or something. Go slay my dragons. I would advise y'all do the same. So yes, so here's my face again. And just in case you want to know, yes, I'm wearing the same shirt. Y'all have a good day. There's a lot of people in this group that are going through it. So I just want to say shout out to Red Pill Mike. Shout out to a couple of people. And if there's stuff y'all are going through, there's a lot going on right now. Honestly. Anyways, I'll see you on